Rule or be ruled. A Castillo must be a lion, for Yara is full of lambs.
With recent developer promises that players will be able to go anywhere they want at the start of the game and complete the story in almost any order they want, many people have begun wondering how story progression will work in Far Cry 6. In this video, I'm going to present everything we know about story progression in Far Cry 6 so far, and discuss how I think the story should be structured. This is a crucially important topic that ties together the world, narrative, characters, and gameplay, so let's start by reviewing what the developers at Ubisoft have told us so far. First, in an interview by GameRant from July of last year, narrative director Navid Kavari says, "In terms of how you approach the story, if you wanted to start on one part of the island or you wanted to start on the other side of the island, the story would adapt to how you approach it." He goes on to add that when studying real-world revolutions, the development team noted that there are different groups and regions and a huge wide range of characters, and that the story of Far Cry 6 will reflect that. From the very beginning, we can see that the developers of Far Cry 6 were committed to an open-ended, relatively non-linear narrative structure designed to maximize player freedom. It also sounds like there will be various regions with different factions of rebels to play alongside. Next, in an interview with VGC from May of this year, lead gameplay designer David Gravel spoke extensively about the world, vehicles, and travel in Far Cry 6. While discussing flak cannons and outposts, he noted that, as you liberate Yara on land, you can also liberate Yara in the air and see that progression as you go through the story. This reinforces Kavari's earlier statements that the progression in the story will be related in some way to liberating the open world. Finally, in a recent interview with GamesRadar, David Gravel went into more detail on the story progression in Far Cry 6, reiterating that players could go anywhere and start the story anywhere, but also noting that you can tackle missions in almost any order that you want. As he puts it, the narrative was built in such a way that you can start anywhere in the world, you can talk to anyone, and do missions in whatever way you want. We are trying to be as open as we can with players. Player agency is absolutely key. With all of this information in mind, let's talk about the different possibilities for the structure of Far Cry 6's story. The first option, a purely linear story with a set progression of missions, one before the other, until you reach the end of the game, is certainly not going to be how Far Cry 6 works. This style of progression was used in all of the main Far Cry games through Far Cry 4, and while it's simple and straightforward, it gives a lot of control for the developers to fine-tune the development of the characters, motifs, and themes of the game. This is the structure of story progression that gave us the masterpieces Far Cry 3 and 4, and it's still probably my personal favorite way to arrange the narrative of a game. However, it did have some downsides in that it reduced the feasibility of loosely related spin-off stories and often forced the games to limit the availability of the entire map area until later in the story in order to make the advancement of the narrative make sense. Clearly, the developers of Far Cry 6 are taking a different approach to the upcoming game. Moving on from the linear storyline, Far Cry 5 introduced a completely new structure of progression to the Far Cry series. In this game, the world was divided into 3 regions, each with its own story. Aside from a few lines of dialogue scattered throughout, the stories in each region were separate and unrelated, and the player could go anywhere at any time, and could make progress through the stories of multiple regions at once. Moreover, there were no main missions in the open world, only a scattered assortment of character-given missions that the player could choose to accept or ignore. Completing these missions and other side missions contributed towards each region's resistance meter, and at certain checkpoints in the meter, a new main story mission would be triggered automatically, which usually involved the main character being kidnapped and then later released or allowed to escape for indiscernible reasons. Once the stories of all 3 regions were complete, players could trigger the final showdown with antagonist Joseph Seed at his island in the center of the world. This approach had a few advantages. It opened up the map relative to previous games, allowing players to explore anywhere they want as soon as they finished the tutorial. It also let players choose exactly which missions they wanted to do and ignore the ones they found boring. This approach allowed the developers to spend more time on mostly unrelated but nonetheless fun and interesting side stories like the Larry Parker series of missions, because players could undertake these jobs and still earn progress towards the main story. However, Far Cry 5's nonlinear storytelling had numerous downsides as well. Dividing the story into 3 mini-narratives, each about 1/3 the length of a full Far Cry story, meant that there was significantly less time for characters to develop and change and for themes to be presented and elaborated upon. As a result, nearly every character in Far Cry 5 except Joseph Seed himself was flat, static, and uninteresting, and the themes of the game, which could have been very interesting considering that they dealt with issues of progress, political instability, and the overbearing nature of technology, instead felt either forced or half-baked, and never reached the depth for which they aimed. All this not to mention that the method of storytelling forced story progress by way of kidnapping and automatic cutscenes that the player involuntarily triggered simply by doing activities in the open world was frustrating and jarring for many players. The experience of blowing up some hapless cows only to be thrown just a minute later into a torture lecture about the 7 deadly sins irreparably damaged the tonal consistency of Far Cry 5's narrative and further weakened its ability to make players care about the heavy topics the game tried to explore. Fortunately, Far Cry 6 does not have to fall into this same trap. While the developers have made clear their commitment to an open-ended story progression and the ability for players to go anywhere in the world from the very start of the game, there is another way to structure the story progression of Far Cry 6 to get the best out of both the classic linear style and the style of Far Cry 5. On the map of Yara, there are several regions clearly delineated by different colors. While this has not been explicitly confirmed by the developers yet, it appears that these regions will be similar to the regions in Far Cry 5, with each having its own characters, factions, enemies, and story. Given this outline, I propose that instead of a resistance meter or similar mechanic and automatically triggered main story missions, Far Cry 6 should have a linear story within each of these regions, with a defined set of mainline quests to complete in a predetermined order. Otherwise, just like Far Cry 5, the player should be able to move between each of the regions and make progress in each one at will. Although this approach combines the advantages of the classic linear and the Far Cry 5 non-linear styles of progression, it does not solve all of the problems that I described in the last main entry. In particular, having 3 separate stories across 3 regions and trying to weave them into a larger meta-narrative is a difficult task. Somehow, the writers of Far Cry 6 will need to maintain a level of tonal consistency and reach levels of character and thematic development that Far Cry 5 never achieved. One way to do this is to simply have longer stories. More time to get to know characters, understand their motivations, goals, and grievances will go a long way towards immersing players in the world and events of Yara. Additionally, having the events of the story in one region somehow affect that of another would provide for a much more unified experience, in contrast to Far Cry 5's siloed narrative style. While this is difficult to do when players are allowed to make progress in any region at any time, perhaps key events in each region can unlock certain perks, or even introduce certain hindrances for the player or for the Libertad Revolution as a whole that consequently affect gameplay throughout the whole world of Yara. While these are fairly small tweaks to fix what I consider to be inherent issues with the non-linear, region-based storytelling model, I think that with enough creativity, the developers can still provide a stellar narrative experience within the framework of total player freedom that they have committed themselves to. With what we know about Far Cry 6 so far, what are you most looking forward to in the story? Do you agree with my suggestions on a combination of linear and non-linear storytelling styles? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and feel free to suggest which topic I should cover next. Be sure to check out my other Far Cry 6 discussion videos, and subscribe for more analysis of game design like this one. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.